Hello everyone and welcome. This video is both in my series for Procreate for Beginners, but is also in a sub-series about this specific topic, which is the Brush Studio. So this is the first video of what I think will be 3 videos about this topic. I was going to try to do them all together, but I decided that was going to be way too long. So this is the first video in the series of 3. So in this video, I'm going to go through part of the Brush Studio in Procreate, which is where you can either adjust some of the brushes that come already on Procreate, or you can create your own. You have seen me go through some of these in my brushes Procreate for Beginners video, which I will link right here, and also in the description and in my channel, and in my Procreate and digital art playlist that I have on my channel. That's where all my Procreate videos are going to be. But in that brushes video, I did go through a few of these settings and kind of showed you what they meant. I'm going to be going through all of them eventually in this sub-series about the Brush Studio. But for this video, all I'm doing is going through the first couple of the categories, and you'll see that in a minute. So let's get started. Okay, as I said, we are going through the Brush Studio today, so just kind of show you a little bit of what we're going to be doing. So when I say brush, that could be either of these 3 tools up here. There's the paintbrush, the smudge tool, or the eraser tool. Most commonly you use the paintbrush, so you can see that selected by it being blue. All I have to do is touch it. So it's touched once, then you have to touch it again, and it'll bring up the brush library. So then you can pick from any of these brushes that came from Procreate. These with the little paint mark are ones that I have made myself, and I'll kind of show you some of those as we go through these videos about the Brush Studio. But for right now, I'm going to go in the calligraphy category and go to the monoline brush. So then clicking on the monoline brush, when it's already selected again, will bring up the Brush Studio. Now this is what I'm talking about. We're going to go through all of these categories. We're only going to go through the first 5 here on this video. Then we're going to go through some of these the next video, and then the rest of these the next video. And then we're going to start making some brushes together, some different kinds, and I can show you how to do that. So, but this first video, we're going to go over these first 5 categories here. So there's stroke path, stabilization, taper, shape, and grain. But what I want to show you is a few things before I really start getting into the categories. The first thing, if you go to shape, you're going to see whatever's in this square here is the shape of your brush. So you can change this, and there's brushes that have different shapes. This is just a circle one. I'll show you how to change it when we get there. But right now, it's just a circle. And so what this brush is going to do is basically stamp this circle along a path as you're going along. So it's going to stamp circles together. Now if you go back to the stroke path over here, this first one, you see that the first attribute in this thing is spacing. So if I were to increase this, you can kind of see over there in the drawing pad, because it always starts out with a stroke over there, but you can draw yourself as well, that these circles are really spaced out because I increased the spacing. So, and that will you can make it even bigger if you make the brush size bigger, and even the preview size in here. So if you go to drawing pad, you can go into all these things. You can increase the preview size, which, see, that made the circles bigger and the space is a little bigger as well. But so what that's doing again is stamping that shape over and over again based on how big you have the spacing. Now there's other ways that you can change that as well. You can make it even more of a space in other ways. But it's taking that shape, and it's also, so this one in particular, there's also a grain. So this grain is completely solid. You can also do like a texture kind of thing to that circle or whatever shape you're using. So it's taking a shape and a grain together actually, and basically stamping it along the line. And most brushes have the spacing way down. It was on 17 when we started. And you can see it's just stamping a bunch of circles really close together. So that's how a brush works on Procreate, basically. And this is a very simple brush that I picked just to show you this. And the drawing pad kind of is weird sometimes. It doesn't take your whole stroke if it's got too much on there. But you can also clear it here. So clear drawing pad. Now you can also, in case you have changed something on the brush, you can reset the brush here under the drawing pad. It'll reset all brush settings. But you can also do that a couple other ways. And this I did show you in the brush videos that I mentioned earlier, the brush Procreate for Beginners brushes video. I did go over some of this, but so let's say we change the spacing on this brush. You can go to About This Brush down here at the bottom and reset all settings. And that'll do the same exact thing. It'll just take it back to where it was. So then the spacing is at 17 again. And there's one more way you can do that. Just want to show you. So let's change this again. And then hit done. So now you see that this has changed. And now it's kind of a dotted brush. Rather than a solid line like it was. So if you go into this again, you go to the brush and then monoline should be still selected. You can hold it down and drag it to the left and it'll give you these three options. Reset is what's going to do the same thing, and it's going to reset it back so you can see now it's a solid line just like it was before. It's got that 17% spacing again. I'll show you that. See? But also you can share if you want. That's a whole other thing. But you can duplicate this brush if you want. And then you can make changes to it if you want to do it that way too, where you don't have to keep resetting it. So this is the original one, leave it alone. And then you can click on this one and start making changes. So you can make that one into a dotted one if you want. So now you have a dotted monoline brush and then you have a regular monoline brush. And you can also change the name if you want. You can go to About This Brush and then change the name. We're going to get to that though in a different video, so I'm not going to go too much about that right now. But anyway, you can also, now that this is made, you can take this to the left and you can delete it if you want. So there's other options once you have it duplicated. So again, this is like the official Procreate brush, and the one that you duplicated is now your brush that you can make changes to. So there's a difference between the ones on Procreate. You can't delete those. Those are just going to stay. But the ones that you do make, you can delete. So let's go back in now. And there's other things you can change now. We went over the spacing. And the reason why you don't always put it down to 0 is because sometimes that can be a little too much. Like especially at the start of your stroke. But it depends on what look you're going for. So a lot of the brushes will start at like 17. Because otherwise it'll be like it'll be a little jagged because there's too many circles. And you can't really tell when it's small like this. But when you make it bigger, it's clear. So that's 17, but if we go down to 0 or 1, it kind of depends on the shape too. Like this one's not really that different. All right, so let's go back into monoline then. I'm actually going to erase these off of here. Go back into monoline. So we're going under a stroke path first. So I went over the spacing. But again, this will space out whatever it's being stamped along. It will space it out where there's more space in between them or less. A lot of brushes typically don't start at 0. This one doesn't really change as much, but sometimes with the shapes, 0 can be a little bit too jagged. So 17 spaces them out like perfectly. to some, it kind of depends on the shape and the individual brush of where exactly the sweet spot is, but this one is 17. At least that's what they have it set at. So, but you can, like I said, you can change the spacing like that. Then there's also jitter. So what jitter is going to do is, I'll just show you first. So you can see as this increases, let me take it down a little bit. Like you're going along with your pencil drawing, or your finger, depending on what you're doing. And you're drawing, and then what it's doing is it's stamping brushes, but not always like at the center, where it would be if it was at 0. It's stamping them like along, like horizontally along the line, like, you know, a little bit off, and it kind of, you know, goes not exactly the same amount every time. And you can increase the amount of jitter with things, we'll get to that. But, you know, it's basically stamping those circles at a spot that's not necessarily on the path. It's kind of outwards on the path. And again, if you bring this all the way up, it's going to be really out. So that is what jitter does. And then let's clear this. Fall off. Well, let me draw a few things here. Let me draw this down, this up, this left, and this right. Or this right, this left. I know my directions. Anyway, if I bring up fall off here, you're going to see that the stroke falls off, basically. So if you put it all the way up, like, you're not going to be able to draw anything other than that first kind of a little bit of a stroke. But if you bring it down, you know, it'll show more and more and more. And then if you bring it all the way down, it's going to show everything that you write. Bring it like halfway. Like, you can write for a little bit, but it's not going to keep going. So that's what that does. That's most often used when you're making like a stamp brush, which is something we're going to do. We're going to do a couple of those together eventually, but not in this video, but soon. But it's basically when you want to just kind of stamp something and you don't want to accidentally hit one. So that's those three things. Now, another thing I did talk about before is the stabilization category, the Streamline. So this is to kind of smooth out your strokes. So the more streamline you have, the smoother your stroke is going to be, meaning it'll kind of smooth it out a little more, like it streamlines it. Like, you know, if you're going to be like kind of jittery when you're, I mean, it's not going to do miracles here, but if you're going to be kind of like you wanted to draw a little more straight or get like a more of a curved line in there without making too much of a veering too much off your path when you're drawing, you can put the stabilization, the amount of the streamline up, and that will help smooth out your strokes. Now, I'll show you, if I bring it up, you can see it's already changing those. But it's kind of, like, you can kind of see it where when you're taking like turns when you're drawing, it's not completely accurate to where you had it. It's trying to smooth it out as you're going. And let me clear this. It's harder to do the faster you go. So you're like, you can really see it if you're trying to go faster. Like, it's not really putting the line exactly where you have your pencil on the iPad. It's a little too... So when you have a lot of streamline, you have to kind of move slower. Otherwise, you're going to get, you know, things that aren't going to show up exactly how you wanted them to. And if you have the streamline all the way down, then it's not going to do anything. Like, it's just going to follow exactly where you have it. So if you're trying to do like a curve and you can't quite get it right, you're going to want to put your streamline up. So that was the amount. So pressure has to do with, again, the pressure sensitivity of the Apple Pencil. Anytime you see anything that has to do with pressure, there are a few other stylus types that you can get that do have pressure sensitivity as well, that do work with the iPad. Don't ask me, I've never used any of them. All I've used is the Apple Pencil. But if you're just using your finger or you're using a stylus where it doesn't really have that, you're not going to be able to get these pressure sensitivity settings on your strokes. So that's why I always recommend Apple Pencil. But what this does is, so if you have, I have to actually get a pressure sensitive brush in order to do this. So I'm going to go down to the script here. So go to Stabilization. Let me show you just a max version. It's kind of hard to see on here because it doesn't, also undo doesn't work on there, just so you know. I keep forgetting that. Like, if you can kind of see while I'm drawing, because after I do the stroke, it doesn't keep it on there. I'd have to kind of go on the regular, which I could do. So this is with it on max. I'll explain when I get a few of these on here. Let me just bring it down to like 50. And then all the way down. So you see that there's more of a dramatic difference in the pressure when it's all the way down. So here it's kind of, with the max on, it's kind of smoothing out the difference between the pressure, and with it off, it's not really doing much. Obviously those bigger parts are where I'm pushing down further. And I was trying to keep it, you know, similar. Back up again. Around 50. Here we go. I mean, those are looking kind of similar, but it's not as big. And then if I put it all the way up, you can see that it's not really changing as much. It's being more gradual about it. Like, these are like the thin strokes with light pressure is very different than the thick strokes with heavy pressure. And again, I tried to keep the pressure the same on these. So this was max, or this was 0, this was 50%, and this was max. And same here, this was 0, 50% max. So it has to do with the pressure and how much pressure you're putting on the pencil and how stabilized the difference is between the thin, light pressure with the thick, heavy pressure, if that makes sense. I know that might be a lot to grasp right now if you don't if you're not familiar with any of that. But that's what that does, and I will explain that a little more when we do something that's more pressure sensitive and in a brush. Anyway, let's go back to monoline. Wait, let me reset this first before I forget. All right, and then let me reset this too. All right, and I'm gonna clear this. So that is that. So then stabilization. So it's kind of similar to Streamline, except let me do kind of a straight line, and then let me do like a wavy line, and let me do like a really wavy line. So if you do stabilization, it's going to stabilize these strokes, and then what it's doing is taking an average of where they are. So you can see, like, even this one, it made almost, I mean, it was like in general going this way, but like almost like a straight line arc basically over there. But you can see originally it looked like that, but it's got that kind of shape. That's kind of an extreme version of the Streamline. So if you have this up, like, you can be really wavy and weird, and it's going to kind of straighten it out as you go. And this also has to do with the speed you go at too. So versus, like, it's going to look very different if you do it slowly versus fast. Like, it's going to, well, that was also a straight line anyway, but if I'm being wobbly faster, it's going to straighten it out more, if that makes sense. Whereas if I'm being wobbly slower, it might start straightening out the wrong parts. And it all depends on what you're trying to do. But that's what that does. So, clear. Now, motion filtering. So motion filtering is going to do kind of a similar thing to stabilization, except that it doesn't matter how fast you go. So let me do a slower one, a fast one, a really fast one. So you can see on the slower one, I'm going to do one in person here. It's still kind of taking it wrong, but it's as you're going along. But it's not as dramatic as the stabilization was when it's slow. Like, it's a little more subtle. So let me actually clear this out. I'm going to draw a few more things here. Well, that one went off the screen, that's why that did that. Same with that one. But it's not like taking it at the wrong spot as much. Now what expression does, once you have to have this on a little bit in order to use expression. Expression puts a little bit of the expression back in your stroke. So what that means is, you can tell so much with these lines. Let me do something else. It's hard to do with the drawing pad because it doesn't act quite the same as a canvas. Yeah, it's really hard to do. Here you can kind of see. So I didn't put it on all the way up here. But you can see it's kind of putting some expression back into the stroke, so that's getting it closer to what it used to be, like before you messed with it. So it's kind of fine-tuning the motion filtering a little bit. because it might look too smoothed out. So again, these are all things you can kind of play with to try to get the strokes the way, and it all depends on, you know, what your muscle is like when your muscles are like when you are writing. You know, maybe they're not developed enough and you get kind of shaky. So you can get all kinds of different things going on. And there's also a way to stabilize your entire canvas, like the strokes on your canvas. That's something I'm going to talk about in my miscellaneous video that's coming out way like after this brush studio series comes out and the animation series we're doing. So I'll get to that eventually. But there is a way to kind of stabilize all of your strokes on a canvas or on a layer. And we'll talk about that when I get there. But this is how you can stabilize them as you're drawing. And, you know, depending on which pen you're using, brush you're using, not pen. Could be a pen, I suppose. But anyway, that is that. So I'm going to reset all this. Again, these are ways to kind of get your stroke to do what you want it to do. So then if you go to taper, this is going to deal with the start and end of your strokes here. All right, so taper. First of all, there's pressure taper and there's touch taper. Pressure has to do with, again, if you're using the Apple Pencil or another stylus that has the pressure sensitivity. Touch is if you're using your finger or another stylus that doesn't have pressure sensitivity. So for both of these, you can see that there is like this little diagram up here that has these nodes. This is the start of the stroke. This is the end of the stroke. So if you move these, you can see that it's giving more of a tapered look to that. So it might be hard to see on this brush because there isn't any pressure sensitivity to it. So let me actually use a different brush. Let's try this chalk one. Go to taper. Using your finger. Actually can't get it to work very well at the beginning there. But the end I can. Basically, this is like the start and the end of the stroke is kind of tapering off. And that's what it's doing. Now you can change, you know, a bunch of things here that make it more dramatic or not. First, this link tip sizes is actually going to make it so both of those nodes, if you move one, it's going to move the other the exact same amount. So, you know, it's going to depend on how you want the taper to be. Size is how dramatic the taper is from thick to thin. So you can see that's very large on this one. If I bring it down, see that the taper actually isn't getting that smaller where it was on these. That's close. Opacity is going to change the opacity of your taper, so it's going to be less opaque in the beginning and end. Let me reset this. And then pressure. If you increase that, it's going to respond more to the pressure you're putting on the Apple Pencil. As far as taper goes, And then tip is how big the tip of your taper is, you know, at the typical start and end. So you bring that, it's going to be very sharp. You can see it there. And then if you bring it all the way up here, it's going to be blunt. You can see it's kind of rounded off, rather than being like very sharp. And then it was somewhere down in the middle, I think 37. I'm going to reset anyway. So, but that's what that all does. Now you can do all the same with the touch taper, which again is using your finger. Sharp and blunt. Opacity, I think that changes a little bit, not very much on here. And then size, again, bigger the size, the more dramatic the taper is going to be. So then the classic taper button here is just because there's a way that certain people are used to, who used to make brushes before Procreate had like its latest update. Well, not the latest one, the latest big one that they had, which was a few years ago, or a year and a half, 2 years, I don't remember exactly, where they put more stuff in here and they kind of move things around. And like this is like there's a difference between the classic and the new version. You can see already that that start stroke on the classic actually tapers properly. I'm not sure why they would have changed that. So now you get that, you know, nice tapered in the beginning as well, which I was having trouble getting. So now I know the difference. Versus without it, you know, it didn't really give much of a tapered beginning. So that is, it depends on the brush, but that is kind of the difference between the classic and the modern, I guess, version. So those are the tapers. Now let me reset this. We're going to go back into monoline again. This was reset, right? Let's do it again just to make sure. All right, so then go into shape. Now I told you that this uses a circle and it just stamps the circle over and over and over again. Well, you can change the shape in a few different ways. If you go to edit here, import. So you can import a photo if you want. You can import a file. You can paste something that you have drawn, which is usually the way that a lot of people make brushes. But there's also a source library here that they have, that they include. So you can use any of these shapes if you want to try to make something. So I want to get something that's sort of asymmetrical because some of these things matter that way. I'm going to use this garden gum, which is kind of leaves. So that is now going to be the shape of this brush. So then you hit done, and that's now the shape. Now you can't really tell much here. Even if I increase the size, it's probably not going to show very much. I mean, you can kind of see that beginning. And then it's not exactly connecting because now with this shape, it's not, the spacing is not correct. Like you'd have to bring it down to make it smoother. But if I space it out, you can see it's stamping that weird shape rather than the circle, because that is now the shape that's using for the brush. So as you can see, that shape is stamped now along the line, just like the circle was. And all these things are going to change the way that that shape is kind of stamped around. If I show you what scatter is, you're going to see that all those shapes kind of move around. I'm I might want to make this bigger if I can. It's already at max. But I think you can see that where those shapes are kind of randomly moving around. Like the orientation, the way they're stamped on is different if you increase the scatter. Whereas if you leave it down there, they're all the same as you go through. And then kind of similar, your rotation is, I mean, if you have scatter all the way down, then they're still going to rotate the same, all the shapes are going to rotate the same way. But they're rotating the way they're stamped, like along the stroke path. But if you were to turn scatter up and then do rotation, that, you know, changes even more. Like it more randomizes it, basically. So you can do more than one of these things. You don't have to do one or the other. Now, the next thing I have to actually use a different shape for, because you're not going to be able to tell very much with this one. So I'm going to go to the source library again. And I'm going to find one like this ultra soft one, where you can see like it's kind of transparent. So I'm going to hit done. Now what this is going to do, so count is how many things are stamped in one spot along the stroke path again. So if you increase the count, it's going to be a little darker, obviously. And it goes all the way up to 16 that you can stamp in one spot, or just one. So again, one is just that shape the way it is, very transparent. But you can increase the opacity if you want by increasing the count, therefore increasing the amount of shapes that get stamped in each spot. Now, if you were to turn this up, let's say to 10, and you turn up count jitter, what that's going to do is kind of randomize, and the more you do it, the more it gets randomized. But it's randomizing each of those spots along the stroke path, how many are on there. So like this first one is pretty dark, that could be 10 because it's up to 10. And then some of these over here are very light, so those are probably 1. And these are a little bit darker, maybe that's 2 or 3. So it randomizes the amount every time. So anywhere, and this count is going to be how many it randomizes up to. So 16, it's going to have 16 in some spots and then 1 in others, so there's going to be more of a contrast. Whereas if you bring it down to like 3, then this is just either 1, 2, or 3 stamped in a spot along the way. So obviously if you're dealing with something that's solid and totally symmetrical like a circle, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the count and count jitter on those lines. That's not going to do anything. But if you're doing something that has some opacity, or even, I mean, I could have used the one we had before, which I'll switch it back to that anyway because I need it for the rest of these. So I'm going to go back to source library, find the garden gum again. It's down here somewhere. Here it is. And then you can see this doesn't really change here because it's all the same, but if you start scattering them and rotating, you can kind of see in some spots where it's darker because more were stamped, but they're kind of stamped. So like this one here and this one, like you can tell there's a bunch of those stamped on top of each other. Like I wish you could zoom in on here, but you can't. I'd have to do that on the actual canvas, which I could do, I suppose. But then we have to keep coming in here and changing things. But anyway, some of these that are like darker, you can tell that there's more counts there. As I increase, you can tell because the shape is randomized every time. you know. So even though it's mostly solid here, you can tell because the shape gets randomized. Because this way you can't really tell because it's just, they're all in the same spot. So I hope that makes sense with all these things together. Now, randomize is going to randomize the way your stroke starts. So if you see the beginning of that stroke there, it's going to, and then the rest of it's going to follow. But it randomizes the orientation of that stroke. So sometimes it may start that way. You know, the orientation of that shape is different with every start of the stroke. And again, you can change all this as well, so it's going to start changing even more things. But that makes it so the stroke is sort of different, a little different every time, and you can change how different you want it to be. So that's what that is. So that's what that is. Azimuth is something that you use with the Apple Pencil specifically. So I'm not sure if this brush is going to be the best way to the shape, I mean, is going to be the best way to show this, but I will try. Let's see if it works. So this has to do with the tilt, the way your pencil is tilted when you do your stroke. So it's going to change. So I'm going to tilt it this way, and then I'm going to tilt it this way, and tilt it this way. And you can see that that shape kind of follows the tip of your pencil. And responds to the way that it's tilted on the screen. Whereas if you're using your finger, it's not going to do that really. I mean, it changes orientation a little bit, but it doesn't. See, I'm tilting my finger differently and they're starting out the same. So that is what that is. And that's more used for things that I do, like lettering and calligraphy. It's something that, you know, most of my pencils that I use or pens or markers or brushes or whatever you want to call them. It's what most of the brushes in like calligraphy would do. They're following kind of just how naturally when you make calligraphy without the iPad, you know, it kind of changes depending on how you're holding the pencil. So now, gotta get a stroke on here. So flip X is going to flip some of those shapes horizontally. So you see that some of them were changed. It's kind of randomized. And then flip Y is going to flip them vertically. So some of these are sort of upside down. And then this little graph here, this is going to change the rotation of your shape the way you want it to be. So if you don't want to like randomize it, you know, this is like the baseline of your shape, changing it, but so that it's consistent every time too. So but that changes like the way it's rotated, because if you have it where it's normal, it's going to show up exactly like it's shown up here. But if you want it to show up a little different as you're, you know, and you're going to have them all follow the same, then you would change this. And And this all depends on, you know, the shape you're using and whatever result you're trying to get out of it. And then these two nodes, these blue ones, you can bring inside the circle here and they kind of squish the shape down. So basically, going back up to the shape here, it's kind of squishing the vertical space of your square. Pressure roundness is based on your pressure that you put on the pencil. So let me clear this out. So it's going to squish it like you did with the blue nodes, except it's going to squish it only based on the pressure used. So right there, I put more pressure in the middle there. Of course, it went away, but I put more pressure in the middle here, and the shapes were more normal. And when I didn't do that, they squished down. But that's if you do it this way. If you do it this way, it's going to be the opposite. So again, light pressure, harder pressure, light pressure. So it's the opposite if you do it that way. So that's how you do that. And then tilt is going to be, again, the way you tilt your pencil. So it's a little more subtle and harder to get a change there. You can kind of see when I was going like this, they're a little more squished versus this. If I bring this up a little. It's a little more subtle, like I said. There's a little bit of a, of course, it goes away, but there's a little bit of a difference based on which way I'm holding the pencil. Like more horizontal, like this gets a little more squished. But anyway, that is what that does. And then, yeah, obviously it would be opposite the other way. And then this filtering is the shape itself here. No filtering makes it look exactly like that shape. Classic filtering and improved filtering are going to change a little bit. There isn't much of a difference on this shape, but both classic filtering and improved filtering are kind of softening the edges of the shape. These are a little more sharp. If you can see on the camera, I'm not sure how well you can see that. These are like more opaque, more contrasted to the background, and filtering are kind of softening them a little bit around the edges. And like I said, there isn't much difference here between classic and filtering. It's not really showing much of a difference on this shape. If I use a different shape, it might. But again, with classic, just like with the taper, classic is like the old way that Procreate used to do it, and then they have like improved, which they say is an improvement, and maybe it is in some cases, and maybe in some cases it's not. That's why they still have the classic available. So it all depends, again, on the shape you're using, whichever one looks better to you, or if you don't want any filtering at all. So that's shape. So then let me reset this, and then we'll move on to increase the preview size a little bit. We'll move on to grain, and I'm going to keep it this circle but you know what I'm going to do though? I'm going to increase the spacing again so I can see. All right, so then going back to grain. Now, like I said, this is like the texture within that shape. So right now this is just plain normal, so it's just a solid circle. But if we change that, there's also a source library for grain. So if you go into source library, you can see there's grain source and shape source here. These are all the textures that are, again, pre-uploaded into Procreate that you can use, and you can create your own as well if you want. So what do I want to use? Let's do this tessellated texture for this. So you're going to see that shows up now in all those circles. So you have that texture going, and this would go within any shape that you're using. Now there's two different things here, moving and texturized. Texturized is basically taking that texture and kind of putting it on your entire canvas, and then you kind of, as you're drawing your shapes, or your strokes, I mean, with your brush, you're kind of revealing that texture behind. And then there's a few different things you can change, like you can change the scale, which means, you know, basically zooming in on that texture on the entire canvas or making it smaller. And then depth is like the opacity. And then, you know, you can change the brightness and the contrast as well. And then we also have the no filtering again, which doesn't filter at all. The filtering classic and improved, which soften the edges. And you can see there's not really much of a change here, but that's probably because we haven't really changed anything else. I put it all kind of back where it was. So you may be able to get like a different and it may be the grain as well that's not really changing. And then green follows camera that's 3D. So again, that's not something I'm going into in my videos, but when you do if you're doing like a 3D shape, and that's what you're using Procreate for, this will follow the camera that you're looking at the 3D shape as. And you know, someday I might get into using 3D on Procreate, and I'll have videos about that. Right now I don't. There's probably someone else out there who does. But anyway, that was under the texturized category. So again, that is like taking that texture and just putting it on your canvas, and you're kind of revealing it with your brush. Moving is actually taking that texture and kind of manipulating it within that shape. And so your movement like the more you increase it, the more it kind of squishes and kind of distorts that shape a little bit within the shape that you're using, the shape that you're using for your brush, the circle in this case. And then scale is just going to obviously increase the size of the texture within your brush, or within your shape. Hard to keep all this straight. Anyway, you can see. And then zoom is, well, let's increase that a little bit and increase this. If you put it all the way down, it's follow size, means that it'll scale it along with your brush size. So smaller your brush is, the smaller your scale is going to be for your grain. But then if you make your brush bigger, the scale is going to get larger as well. And then if you increase it to cropped, it's going to keep that texture size fixed no matter the size of your brush. And then you can have, you know, in between if you want. You know, this would mean it would change it a little bit with the size, and this would change a little more with the size, and this would change completely with the size. So, depends on how you want it to look. And then you can rotate the grain within the shapes either way. And this is follow stroke, so it's going to follow the stroke path. And then the opposite is it's going to be kind of the opposite of what you would expect on the stroke. And then everything in the middle is kind of rotated a bit from that, either direction. Then depth again is going to be like how deep the texture goes, how opaque it looks on the screen. And then you can also change the depth minimum. So if you increase that, then you're able to go all the way down here before it starts really disappearing. But if you had that way down here, and again, so this is depth jitter is kind of changing with each stamp of the brush how many or how deep or opaque the texture is in each circle. So you can see some of them are more opaque than others. And then bringing the depth minimum down will show how far down it can go. So kind of the same with when we did the count and count jitter on the shape. So offset jitter is, if you turn this off, every stroke's going to kind of start out the same. But if you turn it on, it's going to do that thing where it kind of randomizes the beginning of the stroke and makes them all look a little different. So now you notice there's a blend mode on here as well, like there was with the layer blend modes that we went through in another video. And there isn't as many options, but this is all to, in the similar way that the layer blend modes work. It's going to affect how the texture behaves with the color that you're picking for your stroke. So right now it's white, but this is how the texture blends in with the layer. You can think of it as a layer underneath, which is the color that you're using for your stroke. So that's what that is. And those are similar to the layer blend modes that I went through in another video. Now you can also change the brightness and contrast again if you want. And then there's the no filtering again. If we turn this off, maybe that'll help. Maybe not. But again, the filtering is supposed to be like softening the edges of the grain, but that may be because this is kind of a very contrasty grain, a very dark in spots. But again, this is kind of just another way you can get a different look to the way that your grain looks, as with everything else on here. And then again, 3D behavior, grain follows camera. I'm not going over that because I don't do anything 3D on Procreate myself. I'm going to clear the drawing pad. So that is the extent of this video. We're going to go through the rest of these in another 2 videos, I think. Maybe 1, we'll see. We'll see how long this one ends up being with the rest of this stuff. But that was it for this one. So let me just reset this brush back to normal, and I'll see you in the next one. And as I just said, there's probably going to be 2 more videos in this series, this Brush Studio series, where I will go through the rest of the categories in the Brush Studio. And after we get through all the categories, I'm going to do a couple example brushes with you where you can make your own. And those will probably be kind of mini videos because they're not going to be that long. And then after that, I'm going to explain the animation assist feature in Procreate. And just like with the make your own brushes videos that we're going to do, I'm going to do a few make your own animation videos to show you different ways you can animate on Procreate. So a few of those. And then after that, I do have 1 miscellaneous category video that has to do with all the other stuff that I haven't talked about yet. And then the Procreate for Beginners series will technically be done at that point. And then after that, I'm going to be doing projects every once in a while on this channel related to Procreate that you can do to help you grasp some of these concepts together with other concepts. So not just looking at them isolated like we have been doing, but show you a more practical way to use them. So those are coming soon after we get through the rest of these videos. And I will continue to release them throughout my channel occasionally. So that's what you have to look forward to on this channel as far as Procreate is concerned. And I will see you in the next video. Part 2.